Sony Corporation had been taken over by was being run by a friend of mine, Sir Howard Stringer, first Occidental in history to run that Japanese company. And they had announced that they were purchasing MGM Studios. Now, why was that significant to me? Well, it was significant to me because MGM had acquired, through bankruptcy, a company called Orion, which had all the underlying rights to Cagney Lacey. I had sold those years and years and years ago in an effort to get the money to have a script written. They put up $25,000 of highly speculative money and came up with a $100 million piece of property. It wasn't a bad investment. So I was interested in that headline I read, and it also occurred to me that it was going to be about 25 years since the inception of Cagney Lacey. So a silver anniversary was on the horizon. And it got me thinking that somebody should do something about that. And I couldn't imagine who would do it if it wasn't me. So I contacted Sir Howard and wrote him an email, actually, and I said, is this good for the Jews, and is it good for Cagney and Lacey? And he wrote me back and he said, yes and yes. So I began to have a series of meetings with Sony Corporation, where I was introduced by the head of the company to the head of the television division, who had a son at USC. This was a good beginning. And we began to devise a major concept around Cagney and Lacey, not as a vintage television series, but as an iconic television series. We were talking about this becoming the year of the woman. After all, it was quite possible, it seemed at that time, that a woman over 50 by the name of Helen Mirren might win an Oscar, and that Nancy Pelosi was up for the speakership of the House of Representatives, and that maybe Hillary Clinton would be running for be the first woman president of the United States. And I had no problem pointing out that this all started with me and Cagney and Lacey. One night, Fanny's impatience at my lack of screen credit had me on the very treacherous ground of trying to explain television development to a civilian. At best, this is a trying and difficult conversation with a woman in her 80s, not noted for her powers of concentration even as a youth. This was a formidable task. It's like the schmata business, Grandma. I thought I might have a chance here by comparing my trade to the one industry Fanny really knew. For years, she had labored as a seamstress in the garment district in Los Angeles. I go in with my dresses. Some are long, some are short, some have patterns, some have bright colors. Grandma Fanny was smiling. She was enjoying this. Am I a storyteller or what? I go into Cole of California, into Martin, and I go into Catalina Casuals, but right now no one is buying my dresses. There was a pause. I presumed the metaphor was sinking in. Maybe I could help, she said. I put down my chicken leg. The napkin hid my supercilious grin. Grandma, how could you help? Her tone indicated that the word schmuck might well have preceded her imperious statement. I know about dresses. No, you misunderstand. It's an analogy. I said this very slowly, pedagogically. There really are no dresses, Grandma. They're ideas, projects, potential television shows. And it's not really Cole, Martin, or Catalina. It's ABC, NBC, and CBS, see? I go in with my stuff and nobody's buying. I looked at her. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on me. I nodded slightly as if to say, you get it? Then limply added, they're not buying my dresses. Grandma Fanny nodded sagely. She drew in her breath through her nose, then slowly, thoughtfully let it escape before speaking. Maybe you should make men's suits. This is a little bit about, it's something I usually do to cinema students, because it's a little bit about the role of the producer that people don't really think of as the role of the producer. So I'll tell this story. And it was kind of an important moment in the life of the series, early days. Jack Gus was at my home on a Sunday afternoon to discuss his rewrite of Claudia Adams' teleplay of the Cagney Lacey episode we were to call Street Scene, to be directed by Ray Danton. The story predated the Bernard Goetz case in New York, but was similar in that a seemingly normal citizen civilian gets a gun and shoots a neighborhood teenage hoodlum. We were only weeks away from principal photography. Early in the story, Cagney and Lacey returned to the apartment building that was not only the scene of the crime, but the home of both the victim and the aging gunman. In the script, there was a scene where our two detectives interrogated the wife of the man they arrested for the killing. She was described as a 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair. Our heroine listened and took notes as the woman told them of how, years before, she and her husband had come to America with great hope of building a new and better life, and how ultimately, for them, the American dream had failed. The neighborhood they had lived in continued to deteriorate until finally it had fallen into its current state of disrepair. Gangs of hoodlums ruled the streets and dominated the hallways. Their intimidating graffiti was everywhere. The street toughs had taken to breaking into apartments and stealing Social Security checks from mailboxes. Finally, the woman related her husband could not take it anymore. He bought a gun, and when he once again was harassed by these gangsters, he shot the ringleader. The woman's pain was palpable. Even the hard-bitten Cagney, the screenwriter had added, was moved by her story. You don't have to be as good a writer as Jack Gus to make this kind of scene as an emotional read. Many could write it, and the proof of that is that probably hundreds have. I know I viewed some version of the scene certainly dozens of times. We were in the kitchen of my house. Jack sat across from me, sharing a sandwich. Corday, wife number 2, stood at the sink. The moment was curiously domestic. I was very critical, but not as specific as I like to be. I felt the scene was predictable and ordinary. Worse than that, I said, it's a waste. Our two best actresses are standing there with notepads saying an occasional uh-huh, I exaggerated, while this 70-year-old day player sits in her wheelchair and does a monologue. The scene is a cinematic disaster waiting to happen. Not only that, it's a bore. It's necessary exposition, Barney. Jack was a friend and a pro. He was not overly defensive and was probably right to be somewhat frustrated at my only being critical and not giving direction on how to fix this thing. We were creating a series here. Few rules had been laid down. The 2-hour movie had given us some guidelines, but that had been a very different format and a place and pace than we would be exploring from now on. Movies, after all, have a beginning, middle, and end. Series, the creators hope, will never end. The former are usually plot-driven, while the best of the latter are motivated by character. Gus continued. Somewhere in the section of the story, Cagney and Lacey have to learn what kind of a man the guy they have arrested is and how he got that way. You tell me a better way to do it. There have only been a few major creative moments in my life. This was to become one of them. To accomplish it, I would have to break a cardinal rule of picture making. In only a few sentences, I was going to create a scene that would be a stylistic benchmark for our series. It was a moment that would dictate a philosophy, a way of telling a story that would be unique to our show, that would put the emphasis on the series where I believed it should be, and one that would underline what I perceived to be our primary strength, the acting acumen of our two leads. Put the camera in the hallway, I began. The door to the apartment opens, revealing a little old lady in the background. She's in a wheelchair. She says nothing as Cagney and Lacey come out of the apartment and into the hall. We've just saved $1,000 because the lady's now an extra, not an actress. I parenthetically digress before resuming. The door opens. Our leads are alone in the hallway. The door closes, rather. Our leads are alone in the hallway. Cagney turns to Lacey and says, "Did you learn any more from her because you brought her a quart of Carvey's chicken soup?" I went on describing our cameras following the two women down the hallway. As they walked and talked and argued over what they heard the little old lady say and how they felt about it. Jack, Gus, and Barbara Corday were both listening carefully as I proceeded. What you now have is a scene of conflict that provides information instead of a straight expository scene. Further, the scene of conflict is between your two best actresses, and coincidentally our leads, instead of a monologue by what at best will be a very dicey piece of casting. I pointed out that this new scene also provided us with some great character stuff about our principals. It tells me, for one thing, I said, that Lacey has a husband who makes chicken soup, and that Cagney is embarrassed that her partner resorts to this kind of mothering social work. I maniacally continued. It indicates clearly that Cagney and Lacey perceive the world from two disparate points of view, and thereby sets up the ongoing possibility of always providing us with the necessary ingredients of any good drama: conflict. Better yet, conflict between principals. Jack was now taking notes. The cinematic rule we were breaking was one learned in every freshman cinema class in the country: show, don't tell. We were about to do just the opposite. We had actresses who could talk with the best of them, and that was our strength. I was not so sure we could compete with other cop shows for cinematic pyrotechnics. Besides, ever since The French Connection, the car chase is the time when I went out to get popcorn. Let's do stories of revelation, I said. What I meant by that was that the plots would be revealed to the audience only through the eyes of the leads. We would deny ourselves the legitimate cinematic device of parallel editing, an editorial concept best defined conceptually as Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. I expanded on my thesis. Cagney and Lacey will be at their desks. The phone rings. A burglary is in progress at 53rd and Lexington. By the time they get there, the break-in is over. The perpetrator is gone. Cagney and Lacey deal with the aftermath, with the victims, with each other. How does the work impact their families, and how do they relate to the men with whom they work? Corday had joined us at the kitchen table. She quietly added what was to become my favorite phrase: it's a show about two women who happen to be cops, not two cops who happen to be women. That's right, I said. Who gives a crap about all that cop stuff anyhow? I've seen it. Jack would not give us an argument. It reminded me of a comedian, Henny Youngman, who would raise his left arm, the one holding the violin over his head. Doctor, doctor, it hurts when I do this. The medical man's admonishing response: don't do that. It's the same logic I was enforcing on Cagney and Lacey. I saw what we did well, and I emphasized it. What we weren't good at, I eliminated. I knew we had two great actresses to work with, and a new concept in two women as co-equal leads and partners. What I didn't have was time or money for a great action scene. I was sure that what I was asking for would become our signature. I'm talking about our politics, and the feminine politics. And I write here, in our abortion clinic episode, women going to abortion clinics are being harassed. Cagney and Lacey are assigned the case. The two women have feelings about abortion, and naturally those attitudes are in conflict with each other. But it's not what you might think. They are both in favor of a woman's right to have a choice. In this regard, Cagney, however, is a Roman Catholic. Her father prods her with a reminder that abortion is a mortal sin. And besides, he adds, there's a lot of Irish up top, referring to the potential prejudice of the ambitious Cagney's Catholic superiors in the police department on such matters. Cagney is further upset at the implied sexism of the assignment, and until the harassment turns to bombing, the blonde detective is annoyed over the perceived low-esteemed social work aspect of such a case in terms of career advancement. At the same time, Lacey is the mother of two, and visibly pregnant with a midlife baby. Her choice. What is driving her to stand up to her partner, to help women with this clearly difficult decision? What besides her own humanity? We tell the audience, by way of a Lacey monologue, that at age 19, before meeting her loving and wonderful Harvey, Mary Beth was herself in need of an abortion, and that at that time, such procedures were illegal in the United States. We discover that it is why our heroine did not finish her education. She needed the money, her second semester tuition money, to fly to Puerto Rico and to pay the abortionist. He did not speak English and indicated as if she were a dog that she was to lie atop his operating table. Harvey Lacey, of course, knows the story, but once started, Ancient Mariner-like, his wife must tell it through its completion. She ends on a political note. There's people who want us to go back to that, Harvey. It's okay, honey, he says. It's okay. It'll never be that way again. She nods, remaining steadfast about her prediction. It'll be exactly like that. she says. Where did we get off? This wasn't brain surgery or treating cancer. Not quite, although our multi-award-winning cancer two-parter did emphasize the importance of early detection and the preference for the lumpectomy over the more radical and disfiguring mastectomy, weeks before the New England Journal of Medicine came out with the headlines saying exactly the same thing. We did treat cigarette smoking as an addiction years prior to Surgeon General Koop coming forward with the news that it was one. We had Mary Beth Lacey abstain from drinking alcohol and coffee during her pregnancy over a year before our government made the same recommendations. We advocated safe sex and the use of condoms for the first time on primetime television in the United States, attempting to expose the virulent malignancy of racism in all its aspects of our society, including our own series regulars, and regularly dealt with the sexism and most graphically with the heartbreak of substance abuse. Film clips from our episodes were used to illustrate segments from Nightline, McNeil Lear, CBS Evening News, and Dan Rather, The Today Show, and many other local and sophisticated news broadcasts and informational shows. We were touching people's lives, affecting change, both in behavior and laws. We were lauded in the nation's congressional record. The conceit came to us quite naturally. We believed we were doing something important, and the phrase, "it's only television," never occurred to a single one of us. I'm going to try to top that story with just one last one. And at the risk of hurting you guys who are going to hopefully buy and read this book, I'm going to read you the very ending. I'm going to skip a lot of the preamble, so I leave you time for questions. The religion of the television producer has always preached one primary doctrine. Make 125 episodes of anything, reasonably close to the license fee, and you may spend the rest of your days, should you so desire, floating aboard your own yacht on the Aegean. I didn't get the boat. The promised dollars weren't there. The TV producer's religion, however, isn't always about money. After all it is said and done and dealt with, regardless of the changes of rules by governments, the lawsuits, the wrecked marriages, the greed, stupidity, and downright dishonesty by former partners and self-proclaimed allies, the perceived unfairness of the system, there is one undeniable truth. Had God, all those years ago, visited my office and said, "Barney Rosenzweig, there will be a television series. It will be called Cagney and Lacey, and you will make that show. It will be canceled, and you will save it. More than once, and everyone will know it was you who did so. The network will tell the New York Times and the world that it has made a mistake, and that you, Barney, were right, and they were wrong. Your peers will honor you. There will be Emmys, Golden Globes, and many other honors. You will be celebrated by your university, your community, and your industry. Women's groups throughout the nation will name you their Man of the Year. You and your show will be written of in virtually every television history book for the remainder of the millennium. But there will be no money." I would have filled the briefest moments of silence following all of that with one simple question: God, where do I sign?